Welcome. My name's Michaela Keat, and on behalf of the Speakers Committee here at the College of Law, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Heald Lecture in Administrative Law. This is part of our McKercher Lecture Series, and we have posters around that tell you about all of the great events that we have in the series this term and next term. As we gather here today, we acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to our First Nation and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'd like to begin by saying a note of thanks to the McKercher Law Firm for sponsoring our lecture series now for the last 4 years and allowing us to reach out to the community even beyond the law school itself with some educational, informative, and entertaining speakers here at the law school. The Heald Lecture was established in 1984 by the Honorable Mr. Justice Darrell Heald. Justice Heald, who passed away in 2010, was a graduate of this law school and the university with an arts degree as well. After being called to the bar in 1941, he served in the Air Force until 1945. And after the war, he practiced law and then was elected to the Saskatchewan legislature in 1964, where he later served as the Attorney General and the provincial secretary for this province. In 1975, he was appointed to the Federal Court of Appeal. Mr. Heald initiated this event, this Heald Lecture, here at this law school because and this is something I just learned, we were the first law school in the country to teach administrative law and to recognize it as a distinct course. So I'd now like to take a few moments to welcome our guest speaker, Senator Kim Pate. Senator Pate is no stranger to the college. In fact, I think we'd consider her a friend. Having served as the Ariel Salos Chair in 2014 and 15, and having significant impact on our students, our community, and our faculty colleagues during that time and since that time. Because of that, as I said, we've at least partially claimed her as our own, and we'll continue to do that. First and foremost, the mother of Michael and Madison. She's also a nationally renowned advocate who has spent the last 35 years working in and around the penal systems of Canada with, and I emphasize that, with, as well as on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized people in this country, particularly imprisoned youth and adults. Senator Pate graduated from Dalhousie Law in 1984 with honors in the clinical law program and has completed postgraduate work in the area of forensic mental health. She was, and very well known in this role as well, the executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies from January 1992 until her appointment to the Senate in November of 2016. She's a member of the Order of Canada, a recipient of the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the person's case, the Canadian Bar Association's Bertha Wilson Touchstone Award, and has 5 honorary doctorates. Senator Pate strongly believes that the contributions of women who have experienced marginalization and oppression should be recognized and has respected, and she has worked tirelessly, I would say, to empower those women. We're very pleased and honored to have her back here at the college during a very busy schedule this fall. We had to negotiate back and forth for quite some time to find a time that would work for Senator Pate to come and share this hour with all of you, and I'm so pleased that that worked out. So join me in welcoming Senator Pate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for that generous welcome. I'm going to have to get them to significantly shorten that bio stuff that's on the website. So, I too want to start by acknowledging the traditional territory in which we have the privilege of meeting, as someone who is an uninvited, started as an uninvited guest in Algonquin territory, and as someone who has had the privilege but also the responsibility of walking in, and more importantly, being able to walk out of prisons for young people, for men, for women, for now the better part of 4 decades, it's painfully obvious the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples in this country, not just in this territory, but especially in this territory. So thank you, and I want to acknowledge elders past, present, emerging, who are taking us forward in a new spirit of reconciliation, which doesn't just mean putting Indigenous artwork on the walls or adding, cultural interpretations, but really means struggling with some of the issues that I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk about today. And so, but before I go there, I want to point out that there is artwork here from women. A woman who was criminalized, who her very first art show was at an Elizabeth Fry annual general meeting in Winnipeg, now almost 20 years ago. Her name is Jackie Travers, and she has the 7 grandfather teachings are out I see just outside the door, and I encourage you to look at those, in part because what I'm going to start with is a bit about some of the ways that I think we can be moving forward in this country. And so before I do that, though, I do want to say, those of you who know me know I'm really most interested in, if there are things you really wanted to know about and wanted me to discuss, to let me know so that I can tailor this to meet your needs and make it more interesting for you, and usually for me then too. So if there is anything that you came here that you really wanted to hear about, let me know right now, and I'll make sure if it's not incorporated when I say that, that I'll try and address it. Is there anything any of you came here you really wanted to hear me talk about? I know that doesn't mean that I can say anything and you'll be happy. Okay. Yes, sorry. Healing lodges? Okay. Yes, I was just at one yesterday and the one the day before. So, yes.
I was very interested in whether or not there's any opportunity to strengthen, C-75 as it relates to the over-incarceration of youth specifically the arrest and remand procedures. Having read them, they seem a little bit weak and kept.
Okay.
Is there any opportunity?
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, well, if you do, ask as we go along, and I will do my best to try and address certainly the first one, and the second one I'll have some ideas, so let's put it that way. So one of the things that I wanted to talk a bit about is the importance of right now more than ever, particularly as we see things that are happening south of the border, particularly as we see things happening in elections in this country as well. We've just seen a new election in Ontario and one in Quebec that resulted in some ideas that many of us think will take us back in a direction that, a century ago we started to see arising and saw the implications for our parents and grandparents. Okay, some of you are really young, your grandparents and great-grandparents perhaps. For me, it would be my parents and grandparents. And that we saw the impact of that, and we saw the need for people to recognize we needed to take care of individuals who didn't start from an equal place in terms of having privileges, resources, access to power, and access to those who wield power and resources. And so one of the things that part of the reason I raised the teachings is increasingly I'm looking at how do we actually encourage all of us to take very seriously what those teachings mean in our everyday life. How is it that we can end up in a situation where we dehumanize people routinely if we actually do take into account those teachings? So what do I mean? What are the teachings? Well, those of you who know, you'll know that one is humility, knowing when you don't know everything. And when I just left, I left the Regional Psychiatric Center to come here, and I was meeting with a group of prisoners, and before I left, I said, is there anything you want me to tell? And they said, well, who's going to be there? And I said, well, for sure there'll be some law students. How many law students are here? Okay, so for the law students and the lawyers, the message from prisoners was double educate yourself. What do you think that meant? It's related to humility. It's related to some of the others. What they said is you're learning here about laws, and you're learning about things that are in books and in cases, and you're reading things. But if you never actually go and meet the people, and you don't have the humility to believe that you don't know everything, and you don't have the integrity and the trust, build the trust to actually interact with people, then you actually don't fully educate yourself. And they reminded me of something that I've often said to them, which is, I'd never like to meet you through your paperwork. That too often, the way as lawyers, as people working in corrections, people working in all kinds of fields, social work, psychology, that we meet people that we're going to work with is through their files. And if you meet people through their files, you actually meet them through the lens or interpretation of someone else. You don't meet them as I might meet you if I just came and introduced myself. And so one of the challenges is to how do we do that when sometimes there's high profile cases or high profile issues, and so you do know. And one of the ways is to then actually have the respect to go and be truthful and honest with individuals and talk about what you do know and invite them to share the pieces of information they want you to know about them that you might not get from the file. And I'll just use an example for a minute if you're wondering really about whether this file is relevant, to what you're doing. I want you to just think for a minute. I'm not going to ask anybody to disclose it, but just think for a minute about everything bad, if I can put that label on it, that you know you've ever done or that other people know you've ever done. Your parents, your siblings, your friends, your partner, your kids maybe. Just think about all those things and think if you put them in a big file. And think of if, when you were applying to law school, that's what they got. How many of you think would be in law school if the file that was first introducing you was everything bad you've ever done or that other people interpreted as bad? Well, for most people who are in prison, that is how they're introduced to individuals. And they're introduced by someone getting their file, reading it, and the assumptions that other people have made about them. That's also true in child welfare. It's often true in schools. Most of us, the first time we're documented is when we're either in childcare or in education. And increasingly, systems are trying to do this better. But what usually gets documented in people's files is not all the wonderful things they've done, unless they create their own file, but are the things that people have found problematic. And that's particularly true within the child welfare system or in the prison system or in some other part of the criminal justice system. So that's one thing, is have the humility, the respect, the honesty to deal with people. Last night I was speaking to a woman named Gail Horry, who's a woman I first met. She was segregated in a men's prison, in a segregated area within a men's prison. And she had not been seen by anybody, any advocates, for the better part of 3-4 years. And so when I went to see her, you can imagine, she gave me an earful about all the things that needed to be done for women in prison. And she was a very strong advocate. Some of you will have read cases where she's quoted or cases that she initiated, particularly in administrative law. And when I asked her, I said, what do I need to do to ensure that I actually do the job that I'm embarking on? I was just starting with the National Office of Elizabeth Fry at the time. What do I need to do in order to do this job well and properly? And her first comment was that you need to listen. And she listed what I now know as or have been introduced by elders as the teachings: humility, respect, honesty, being truthful, having wisdom, having courage, and love. She said, if you can't advocate for someone in the way you would advocate for someone who you care about deeply, your brother, your mother, your sister, your auntie, someone you love and care about, if you can't, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. It's not a judgment, but if you can't, don't do it, because you actually won't have the courage to say the things that need to be said to challenge people. You won't have the will to do it. And you need courage, and you need love and humility and all of those other. And the other thing she said is, many people come in and talk to us, although in her case they hadn't for several years. But when they come in, to her, she said, it is just as disrespectful if you come in and you parrot what I say as if you come in and you ignore everything I say. That wouldn't, I've been talking a lot about lately because I'm realizing I'm hearing a lot of people talk about, oh yeah, I'm going to give voice to the powerless and repeat and advocate for the things that people are saying that they want. And what she was saying, it took me a while to understand, was if you come in and I say to you, I'll give you an example of one we did talk about and that we argued about, was about whether women should be in prisons for men. She was in a prison for men. And her initial response was, they should be in a prison for men. And I said, well, why? And she said, because it's the only place you can get access to post-secondary education. That was at that time. That's no longer true. Since 1992, post-secondary education has not been funded in the prisons. But at that time, it was just being phased out. And I said, so what you're really saying is that you want access to post-secondary education, and you don't get that in the prisons for women. There was only one prison for women. So what you're really saying is you want access to that, not that you want to be in a men's prison. And she stopped and she said, that's exactly what I mean. You come in here, you have some idea of what else is possible, what is out there in the world. I'm in here with limited access. If you didn't respect me enough to challenge that and you just went out and started advocating that women be in men's prisons so they can access education, that would be just as disrespectful as if you never came and listened to me. And so it taught me something. And I was talking about this last year in New Zealand, and the High Commissioner for Canada was there. And afterwards he came up and he was in tears. And he said, I just got what's wrong with what we did last year. And I said, what did you do last year? And he said, well, we went in to one of the Pacific Islands, because the High Commissioner for New Zealand is also the High Commissioner for Pacific Islands for Canada. And he said, we built a cage in the prison. Everybody asked us to build a cage in this prison. We built a cage in the prison to lock women in at night. The women asked for it. The correctional officers asked for it. The Canadian representative asked for it. The community asked for it. And he said, I now realize we should have asked why. And when they told us, I said, well, you told me why. And he goes, because they were all asking because at night the women were being raped by the men in prison. And so the women asked for a cage to be locked in so they wouldn't be raped at night. And he said, and now I'm realizing what we should have said is, let's get the women out of there. Let's create a resource in the community. Let's do something else. But let's not just accept, because the women said they wanted a cage. We build a cage in the prison to lock them in at night to keep them safe. That's the kind of iterative process, respectful engagement that too often doesn't happen, not just with people in prison, but with people who are poor, people who are otherwise racialized, people who are perceived as not being in an equal position. The presumption is that either they can't understand the information that we have access to and that we can tell them what to do, or what they're saying we just have to do without ever questioning. And I'm going to continue to encourage all of us to think about how we actually share knowledge. As lawyers, you become privileged with information that not everybody has. And part of that privilege, I think, involves learning how to translate that information to anybody who is impacted by those laws and policies so that they can then be part of the process of determining how best to resolve whatever issues exist. And so I think that for me has been vital. It led to, when I was appointed, one of the reasons that I agreed to even have my name go forward for the Senate was because there were many people who said, we haven't had a voice in the Senate since 1996. Senator Earl Hastings, who died while he was still in the Senate, was the last person really focused on prison issues. And he had a particular focus. It was more about men, and that's okay. And it was about longer sentences, and that's okay. But so some of the individuals who were suggesting this said, we actually could use a voice. And if what the Prime Minister is saying, he wasn't the Prime Minister, he became the Prime Minister during that process, but if the Prime Minister, what he's saying is really true, that he wants the Senate to be what the body of sober second thought it was initially envisioned to be, then we need people who are willing to challenge the status quo, who are willing to not just follow partisan politics. And it intrigued me. I thought they were having, let's say, dreaming in Technicolor, that there was a chance anybody who had, it's not like I hadn't been vocal up until then. And it was, unlikely that any party would ever put me in as a partisan appointment. So I had no idea and no illusions that I would get picked. So nobody was more shocked than I was when it happened. But when it happened, the other thing it did to me is really, I take this responsibility very seriously. I have never agreed to work in the government before. And I have agreed to take this on. And I take the responsibility that goes with that very seriously, because one of the roles most people don't know that senators have, we're not elected officials. And so one of the expectations is that we're looking at the long range for this country, that we're looking for the rights of those who are often don't have a voice in terms of elections, because elected politicians are looking to what can help get them elected and what's popular. Part of our responsibility is to represent what's referred to as minority interests, the interests of those who often are not represented in that electoral process. So I feel very strongly that the resources and the privileges that I have now have access to mean that I have to use them in ways that will try and alleviate that. So what are some of the things we're working on? Well, one of them that some of you will know, you've heard me speak about before in other contexts, is, of course, the criminal justice reform, and I'll come back to the question you had about C-75. There are some criminal justice issues. Right as I'm standing here, what time is it in Ottawa? It is, yes, right about now, they're debating a bill on capacity to consent that I tried to make some amendments to improve the protection of women complainants. Defeated at committee, may be revisited at some point, but that would be an example of one thing. So trying to move amendments to bills that are coming forward. Some of you know I've also put forth a private member's bill on mandatory minimum sentences, specifically allowing judges the discretion to not impose them. Another bill that we're getting ready to introduce is a conviction expiry bill, which would allow get rid of the bureaucracy for the record suspension process that currently exists, and have a process of expiration of convictions so that people would not have to go through the bureaucracy of applying, nor would they have to go through the huge expense. It's at least 7, 8, 9, depending on whether you use one of the services, which, by the way, makes you do all the work. So if you're ever suggesting a process for someone, and so it would be without those costs as well. And then the other one that I'm just starting to work on is how do we develop a national initiative around guaranteed livable incomes to basically stop us policing people's incomes and capitalize on the research that's been done on basic income, not just the most recent in Ontario, and the work that's being done in British Columbia, but the work that was done in Manitoba years ago in the 70s, which showed that despite all the naysayers saying that if you give people a livable income, you'll just create a community of layabouts, what we know from what happened in Manitoba, because of Evelyn Forget's research, is that in that community, in communities, we know mostly about Dauphin, Manitoba, but there were 3 other communities as well. In those communities where they allowed people to have a guaranteed livable income, only 2 groups stayed home more when they had an income than did before. Does anybody know who they are? Who would you think might stay home more if you had an income that might otherwise not be able to stay home? Single mothers, yes. So it was single moms and young moms, moms who had children. They might actually not just be single, but they had to go to work to support their families. So that group stayed home. Now it might be more young men as well, but at that time it was the 70s, it was young women. And the other group was a group of young men. It would impact some of you, perhaps. Maybe not you, but. So it was young men who wanted to get an education. So instead of having to work to support their families, sometimes it was their siblings, their parents, as well as, and sometimes it was their children. But instead of doing that, they were able to actually get the the income, the basic income, and then go to school. And so the long-term impact they found was that for the entire community, the standard of living improved, the income levels of the entire community over time improved, the cost of health care went down, and Evelyn Forget is an economist who started doing this work because she worked in the North End in Winnipeg in a hospital where she saw huge numbers of people, mostly poor people, immigrant and Indigenous people, coming in for emergency care for issues that could have been dealt with if they had adequate access to dental care and preventative health care long before. But if they were on the street, or they were poor, or they couldn't afford medication, they likely would end up in the hospital when it was an emergency situation. So the cost of health care went down, and the cost of the criminal justice system. She wasn't even looking at the criminal justice system, but what they found was the crime rate went down, and so the cost of the criminal justice system went down. And she is now about to release a new book. It's coming out this month, so watch for it. There's also a new book by Art Eggleton, who just recently retired senator. Those of you who don't know, we retire at 75 unless we cark it before. So, we're on our 75th birthday, it's like out the door we go. Well, he turned 75 last week. But one of his parting comments was that we need to continue doing this work. And there's a free ebook that you can access that he put out that also focuses on this. But Evelyn Forget has said that we could, she's taken the Auditor General's numbers based on what was happening with the most recent experiment in Ontario, and says that if we actually invest, we could within a very short time, only 2 electoral cycles, recoup the costs that it would cost to actually implement a basic income. And that doesn't even take into account what happens in communities like up north where I was visiting last month, where I'm talking to elders and they're saying, we really want to take our kids out on the land. We want them to learn our language. We want to learn the culture. We can't, because if they're on social assistance or unemployment, they're expected to be in community looking for non-existent jobs. And so what they end up doing is sitting either, doing reading, doing video games, whatever, and as some of them said, sometimes getting into trouble with drugs, alcohol, whatever. And so they said, if we had something like this kind of, they had never heard of the guaranteed income, so we were talking about it as, as this iterative process, and they said that would be great. And I said, well, actually, Evelyn Forget talks about that in communities where right now there is low employment rates, massive other social issues, you could be looking at investing in trades training, you could be looking at off the land, you could be looking at all kinds of different approaches, and not penalizing people and not having social workers mostly policing people. You could have social workers actually going about the job that most people go to school to be social workers for, which is assisting people. Yet most of you know that if you know social workers, it's usually because the jobs they end up doing, especially if they're working for social services, is policing people's behavior and their income. And that's usually not what most people go to school for. So there's a whole argument for that. That's the next bill and initiative that I'll be working on. We're also looking through the Human Rights Committee, which is why I'm here in town and why we're traveling around, looking at human rights in prisons. And so one of the things we're looking at is what has happened over the past 25 years, since the 26 years, since the Corrections and Conditional Release Act was introduced and since the Charter. When you go back, and I'm so old that of course I remember these things, and so we have legal interns, law students working in our office who have gone back to Hansard, gone into the bowels of the Senate and the House of Commons, and found the old records. And what they found was all of the discussion about this legislation was that it was human rights legislation aimed at, guess what? Reducing the number of people in prison, particularly Indigenous people, poor people, women. Guess what's in the mandate letters for the current Minister of Public Safety and Justice? The very same issue. The stats at that time, when the law came in, was that women were about 18, 19, Indigenous women were about 18, 19% of the federal prison population. men were about 10 to 12. Men are now about 25%, women are 40%. In this province, they are 80 to 90%. Kids in custody, girls, Indigenous girls, are 50%. And again, in this province, and the one we're going to tomorrow, Manitoba, it's closer to 90 to 100%. So is that who we think of, that we're most afraid of when we think of risk to public safety? Poor, racialized, Indigenous women and girls, most of whom have histories of physical and or sexual abuse. And I just stop and think about that for a minute. If in fact our system was about dealing with and calling to account and punishing, rehabilitating, whatever sentencing principle you want to focus on, those who cause the greatest harm, then that's who should be in prison. But in fact, that's not the case. And every single prison we have been to now, as part of this committee, this is the last part of our Canadian part of this, every single prison we have heard, not just from prisoners, but I can't tell you how many staff, both as we're walking around, but also countless staff who are asking for private, in-camera meetings with us to talk about what is happening in the prisons. And some of you will have seen the higher profile media accounts where staff are suing, women who have been sexually assaulted are bringing action, racialized violence, all of those sorts of things. So the state of human rights in our prisons is abysmal at this point. And one of the challenges we have is there is such a huge issue, a whole wide array of complex issues, is what do we focus on that might possibly change this? And so some of the things we're looking at are accountability. How do we actually achieve some of the accountability? One of the reasons we're going around the country is when I was appointed, it wasn't my idea. Some people thought it was my idea. It was just coincidence that I had been at an open caucus meeting, which is basically a meeting that's open to the public, where senators and members of parliament had been talking about mental health issues, and we'd raised the issue of prisoners and prisoners' human rights. And that's the genesis. And so when I happened to just come in at the time that was discussion about taking on this issue. And one of the things that because I was lucky to be there at the beginning, I said, we can't really do this if we don't go and see where people are and what's happening in our prisons. And to give an example, if you look at the reports that came out in June from the Public Safety Committee in the House of Commons and the Status of Women Committee, both good reports about prisoners and human rights issues with prisons. One of the things that they didn't do, though, was make the kind of far-reaching recommendations that I think you will hopefully see. I say hopefully because, of course, I'm one of 10 people, and I don't rule the day. But part of the reason I didn't agree to take any leadership position in this committee is if it's not a progressive position, then I always have the option of doing a minority report and talking about what needs to happen. And so one of the things we said is, if we actually want to see what's happening, we have to go to the prisons. Because too often people come and tell us a nice story about what's happening, and you don't actually see what's happening. And Louise Arbour put it very well 2.5 years ago when she challenged a bunch of us. I was there, a whole bunch of people were there. And she said to us, if you're doing work that involves people going to prison, whether you are a police officer, a social worker, a psychologist, a lawyer, whether you're doing defense work, Crown work, or whether you're a judge, if you're doing anything that could impact where that individual might end up, and you don't actually know what the conditions are, where they might end up, then you have no business recommending any of that. And so I heard that, and that was basically what I said back to the senators. And there are three groups of people who have unfettered access, or I shouldn't say unfettered, but have access to the prisons, and it would have to be a significant issue why we would be denied access. And so far there hasn't been one, but there were issues put up. And that is judges have a right of access to all federal penitentiaries, members of parliament, and senators. I encourage you, if you do nothing else after today, to write your member of parliament. Just send them a quick email and ask how many prisons they visited. Ask them if they know what the conditions are in those prisons. And if they've visited a prison, ask them if they've been to segregation in that prison. And if they get told, which we've been told on the last few prisons we went to, there are no segregation units anymore. That's now called Pod C, or that's not called observation. Ask them to go to the place where people are held if they're being observed by themselves. We have to learn, sometimes you have to learn whatever new language is being used. And we need to look at those sorts of options. And I think all of us have a responsibility, every single one of us, to know what those conditions are. And as we're seeing, every senator has understood that the issues that the BC Superior Court did not get in the segregation case, every senator who's gone into the prisons has got. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? What did the BC case say about segregation? Anybody know? Maybe you haven't studied it. So there was just a few big high-profile cases about segregation. People know that? How many know there were some cases about segregation? Okay, so the cases about segregation really focused on, predominantly were about men in segregation, but most of the evidence actually involved women. And what the court essentially concluded, and last week I provided this critique with the judge who made the decision in the room, because those of you who know me know I'm not coming at you backwards. If I have a critique, you're going to get it right. You're going to know it. And so he knew that I was raising this, and I said, I do not understand how you could conclude that segregation is harmful sometimes as quickly as just a couple of hours after someone's placed in isolation or segregation. How you can say it disproportionately impacts Indigenous women and Indigenous men. How you can say there need to be limits, and then say, but it doesn't impact women as much. How do you think that happened? Well, there were two things that happened. One, the group that I used to work with, and many of them are here, Elizabeth Fry, refused to participate in either of those cases because none of the lawyers had the courage to say we should say no segregation for any groups of people. No segregation for people with mental health issues, no segregation for women. And in fact, even at that time, corrections had reduced the number of people in the place called segregation to 5. They had increased the status of segregation throughout the prisons. Does anybody know what I mean by the difference between the place and status? So segregation is both a place that you go to that's called segregation, and segregation is also a status of being separated from the general population of a prison. Increasingly in this country, all maximum security units, prisons within prisons for women, are segregated units. Now I know, which I didn't know when I was arguing with my counterparts involved in those cases, so are the men's. How did the people doing these cases not know it? They weren't going in. I've only been doing this, going into the men's prisons again. I used to do it before I was with E-Fry for a year and a half, and already I can see that's what's happening. Every senator who has gone in has said, what do they mean these aren't segregated? They don't have access to programs. They don't have access to the general population. They don't have access to the yard. They're locked down for extended periods of time. In most cases, they're locked 21 to 22 hours a day. How can that not be segregation? So, and the ones I'm talking about, none of them are lawyers. These senators have gone in. One was a teacher, one was a social worker, and the other one ran a community agency for battered women. And every single, of the most recent ones, and then there were others. One is the conservative senator who's come with us was a homemaker before and a businesswoman. So they all get it just by going in. And yet the people who are arguing the cases wouldn't take the position because they said, that's too radical. We can't do it. And so I urge you to, when you're doing this kind of work, whether it's prison, whether it's social work, whether it's with poor people in the community, again, don't just listen, engage, and challenge them to think about what are the other possibilities. And then most importantly, you have the privileged positions to then have the courage to argue those hard cases. because it's only through arguing them that we will actually move things, in my view, in a much more significant direction. So we now have people trying to intervene after the fact to try and correct this misunderstanding, the misinformation that's getting perpetuated. So don't get me wrong, there are really good things about that case that document how bad segregation can be and that it's no different from solitary confinement in some cases. Not all cases, but in some cases. But what it doesn't do is actually get at the core of how do we actually change it. In a country where we have said it's wrong to put animals in isolation, how can it be that we have not said it's wrong to put human beings in segregation? Only if we don't accept that they have the same entitlement to bodily integrity as you or I, that they have the same opportunity to learn and grow from mistakes as you and I, only if we actually take a very discriminatory set of attitudes towards who they are and what they're entitled to do we do that. So get to healing law, one other thing is, in terms of law reform, I think none of the progressive agenda that the government said they would act upon have really been acted upon. And you've mentioned C-75. One of the things that we're hoping to do is encourage some amendments at committee level. So I'm not on Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, but that's where a lot of the criminal law, the bills come. And so I sit in on all of those, and one of the things we're looking at is can we introduce some of the things like the judicial discretion, like some of the amendments that you're talking about. So any of you who are interested in suggesting amendments we could make, send them to me. It's a great help. I'm shocked at who doesn't get in touch with us, because lots of people have said, well, we can't just call up a senator, and I said, why not? Like, hello, it didn't stop you calling me when I was at EFRI. Why would you not call me when I'm, especially now if I've got access to other things? And so, but the people who have called a lot, guess who they are? Guess who I'm getting lots of calls from? Yeah, people who are in prison and people on the street, people who've known me for some time, and correctional officers. That's exactly right. I'm getting lots of calls from people who say, we know you've talked about this in the past. I'm encouraging those of you who are interested in some of these areas, if you have ideas of how bills can be amended, call up. If you don't get me, you'll get Evan or Emily, who's in our office, or one of the 10 law students who are working as interns, or Happiness, who's a social worker intern who's working with us, and give us that information, share that information. If you think I don't want to have to deal with her, she's a wacky, whatever, then deal with whoever it is you want to call up, and because that's part of our responsibility. I'm particularly responsible for the region of Ontario, but having worked all across this country, including here, as you heard, I feel a responsibility to this community as well. And so, do pick up the phone and let me know. The other thing that I'm interested in is looking at some of what's happened internationally and where leadership has been. But I don't want us to be limited by international precedents. When we're looking at international precedents, whether it's United Nations provisions, UNDRIP, any of those, always remember that United Nations comes up with the floor, not the ceiling. So when you say United Nations says X, always think that was the position everybody could come to agreement on, and it's the floor. Canada is a wealthy, wealthy country in terms of human resources, in terms of natural resources, and we should be expecting a whole lot more. We should be expecting our country to be the human rights leader internationally, not just saying, well, if it hasn't happened somewhere else, we're not going to do it first. And let me give you a few examples of where things are happening. In Portugal, they have now made it unconstitutional to sentence someone to a life in prison, to sentence someone to never having the hope of being able to make amends, have support to be back in the community. It's unconstitutional. What else have they done? They've said, we're not just going to decriminalize marijuana. They've decriminalized all opiates, drugs. And not just decriminalized it, but said, in order to actually achieve what we want to achieve and not just fill our jails with people who may have trauma, who are anesthetizing themselves with drugs or alcohol. What we need to do is, if we're going to stop criminalizing, then what we need, part of the reason we're doing that is our jails are full of people who are really struggling with addictions. So what we need to do is put resources into healthcare, and in particular into supports for people dealing with that trauma and addictions. And so they've invested resources that used to be in the criminal justice system into those areas. So if Portugal can do it, why can't we do it? And I'd say, I'm not good at these kinds of cliche sayings, but let's raise them whatever it is, or whatever, use some football analogy. You guys are big football fans. Like, whatever it is, do the next best thing, the next thing. But we could do that, and Canada can do that. And I think that's part of what we have to do in this country. So I wanted to leave time, and I'm babbling on. So the other thing we have to do is work across sectors and collaborate and build coalitions. None of this will happen if we continue to work in isolation, not looking at how does income, how does racism, how does sexism and misogyny, how do these all impact and create more problems? So we have to be able to work together and deconstruct some of those, but also recognize what we haven't been doing. And I think, again, what's happening with the Supreme Court appointment south of the border, what's happened for the last few years around Me Too and all of that, speaks volumes about how we haven't dealt with it. Yesterday when I was at the Healing Lodge and the women were putting together a red dress to commemorate missing and murdered women, and they were putting ribbons on that dress with the names of all the loved ones, that the people, the women and kids that they know who have died, who they've lost. It was so, I wish everybody could see that and see the connection that most anybody who works in this area knows, that the missing and murdered women and the fact that Indigenous women are the fastest growing prison population are on the same trajectory. Too many Indigenous women who experience violence end up on the street, in jail, or dead. And so we need to continue to work on unpacking those sorts of issues and challenging ourselves. So I want to leave you with a quote that Gail Horry, and I want you to send out all best energy to Gail. Gail is now suffering from a stroke. She just put the after effect of a stroke and Parkinson's, and yet still had her first priority was, what can we do to make sure we do the best for women? She's been out of prison herself for over 20 years. And the quote that she shared with me when I first started with E-Fry is a quote that still drives me, and I'm going to share it with you. It's by a woman named Lilla Watson, and she's an Indigenous activist near Brisbane, Australia, in Yarraga country, and it goes like this: if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So I look forward to your questions. I look forward to continuing to work with those of you I've had the privilege and opportunity to work with in the past. And for those who I'm just meeting for the first time, I look forward to working with all of you. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Kim, your words are both a call for and a demonstration, I think, of what happens when you combine humility with passion and determination. We have about 10 minutes now for questions and discussion before we wrap up. So open it up to the floor.
Steve, what did you want to ask specifically about healing lodges? Yeah. So you're talking about the furor that's been raised about Terry McClintock being transferred.
What kind of future might that hold for
Right. Yeah. I think it is reprehensible, and I've said so publicly, that the tragic death, the murder of a child, and the grief the family, understandable grief and frustration the family is going through, is being used to capitalize on and to make try and make political gain. I think it is atrocious. I think it's reprehensible. And I have been talking to people of all political stripes about how irresponsible I think it is for them to be doing this at this moment when we know, well, no, we don't know. Actually, I talked to an MP as I was walking into the prison yesterday. And I don't think anybody who's commenting about the Healing Lodge, one, has ever been there, and two, knows what the conditions are there. And so as I was describing to one MP as I was walking in, he says, it's open. It says, I said, really, I'm standing at the front door, about to go through a metal detector, have all of my things checked, be wanded, and then I'm going to go down and we're going to visit the segregation unit. It's called a safe lodge here because, you know, sometimes we use different words because we want people to feel better about what we're doing. And including, I think, the minister's office, nobody remembered that that prison, when it was built, including people in Nikanik, I was talking to the people in the community yesterday and the elders, people did not remember that when that prison was built, the elders and the folks who walked the land, the vision keepers, and I had the privilege of walking the land with them just before it was built, talked about this being a place for the women who were then locked at the prison for women in Kingston in maximum security settings. And I was approached by my counterpart, who at the time was Sharon McIver at Native Women's Association of Canada, and asked for our organization, at that time it was Elizabeth Fry, to not oppose a segregation unit going into the Okimaochi Healing Lodge so that maximum security women could go there. And we did not. We said, we respect, that's the vision you have for this prison, this penitentiary. A lot of people think it's a Section 81 or 84 option under the CCRA. It's not. It's a federal penitentiary run by the Correctional Service of Canada. And yes, it doesn't have a big fence around, but anybody who's been there knows it's 35 kilometers down a dirt road from Maple Creek. Does anybody know where Maple Creek is? It's equidistant from Calgary, Regina, and Saskatoon. Now, I'm in a privileged position now. We got to fly yesterday. I've never flown there before. I've usually traveled 4.5, 5 hours with my sisters from E-Fry and women who've been in prison to get there. So people are talking about this without having any idea about who's there. And then they'll say, well, there's people there who, you know, nobody should be there who's maximum security. And so every warden in this country, practically, that I've been in touch with says, you know, they've said expletives too, I won't repeat those, but they've said, you know, please do whatever you can to stop that. The most stable group in our prisons usually are those serving life sentences, because they're often first time, most people don't realize, they're often first time offenders, their first time they're in the system. They're often, I can't tell you how many people, if they don't succeed in killing themselves, spend the rest of their lives regretting and wishing that if there was anything they could do, including taking their own lives, that would bring someone back. Well, there's no way that can happen when it's a murder. And so the presumption that people know what's going on, and then the fact that you've got someone who pled guilty to first-degree murder, and we're being told they're not taking responsibility. I don't know if there's any criminal defense lawyers, and maybe I won't pick on you, but I know there's a few of you here. How many of you would want to plead someone guilty to first-degree murder? I don't know most lawyers who would even agree to that. But I know a whole lot of women who have pled guilty because they insist that they be held responsible, even when they have been acting in concert with men who might also have been their abusers. Nothing I'm saying should be heard as condoning any behavior or excusing it. But when you have that explanation, and that explanation is not put out, I think it's irresponsible as well. And so, you know, when I was at the lodge, many people were saying, would you please stand up and challenge what's happening? We are, but I think we all have that responsibility to do as well, because the reality is what can happen now is we could be going backwards. We still have people who are overclassified. We still have people who are living in segregated maximum security units because of attitudes that were brought to bear 10, 20 years ago. And you know, a number of the victims who called me yesterday, actually, after they heard the House of Commons, some of the debate, was saying, don't they know that like most of us want some help to heal with what's happened, some questions. We don't just want vengeance. We don't just want people forever punished. We actually want to know that something's being done. And if people are taking responsibility and trying to work on themselves, why aren't we encouraging that? So those are people who were, some of them family members had been murdered who were saying that to me. And so, and some of you know in my own family, there's, you know, my daughter has no grandfather on her father's side because he was murdered. I mean, these are, you know, it's not that it's people who don't have some understanding of what the devastation can be in a family because of this, but it is about fundamentally what do we want to set in terms of going forward for all of us. And if we're willing to say that there are some people not worthy of any intervention, I'm not there yet. We have 14 people in this country serving multiple life sentences. Before 2011, we could say in this country that every single person who went to prison, if they worked on issues, if they dealt with the issues they came in with, there was a hope, a chance they might get out. We now have 14 people in this country who that is not true for. I don't want to see any more than that, quite frankly. I think it diminishes all of us in terms of our humanity and what we stand for as a country, as communities, if we don't do that. I also think that it is extremely problematic that we don't go to people who have been victimized and provide supports in those moments. We don't provide anything except the promise of vengeance. And that, I think, is also reprehensible, that we use victims in that way. And so I do think there's lots of work we need to be doing. I think we should, you know, a couple of people said, well, why aren't there healing lodges for victims? Very good question. Why haven't we set up different approaches instead of just saying, you know, you should fight for a very long punitive sentence and then you'll feel better? And most people that I know who have had the privilege of working with who have been labeled victims will say 10, 20 years ago, this has not helped. I need to now deal with, you know, how can I move forward? Families are devastated by it, of course, and so we need to be looking at very different approaches. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Kim, are you available for a few minutes if there are folks who want to continue chatting with
Sure.
you after? Okay. I know that we're going to have to, for the formal part of this, we're very regretfully going to have to wrap this up. But I do invite you, if you want to continue chatting, to come on down and continue. I'm going to invite Alyssa Penn to come and thank Kim on behalf of the LSA.
Senator Pate, on behalf of the students here at the College of Law, we just wanted to say thank you so much for coming and sharing your insights. I believe the insights that you shared and the things that you've done in your past and right now set a standard for how we should be expected to develop.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.